All right. So I believe we left off just sort of summarizing all of these individual cellular functions and looking at the calorogenic effect, right? The fact that all of these functions means that we're going to burn more calories, we're going to utilize biomolecules, we're going to generate more energy as a part of the thyroid hormone function. Okay. Now, what I've got here is an example of the thyroid hormone axis and specifically looking at the types of feedback. All right, so if you think about thyroid hormone, the TRH axis, and then or TRH, thyroid releasing hormone being released from hypothalamus, TSH being released from anterior pituitary, and then we have T3, T4 being released from the thyroid gland itself. Now, there are two forms of feedback. All right. And I actually just noticed there's an error on this one. So the short loop feedback is actually from the pituitary to the hypothalamus. Okay. Let's see if I can correct that. Oh no, I can't correct that here. But please do, I'm going to share this as a separate PDF. Please do correct this in your notes. And we did look at examples of the short and long feedback previously, so definitely refer back to those. But the short loop feedback goes from TSH secreted from the anterior pituitary, has an effect that can decrease TRH from the hypothalamus. The long loop feedback would be T3, T4, having an effect onto the hypothalamus, right? So both of these should be onto the hypothalamus, one coming from thyroid hormone itself, that's the long loop, and then one coming from anterior pituitary, which is the short loop. So the error here is that the short loop is not T4 to TSH, right? So I wish I could correct that on here, but definitely refer to this, the corrected version that I'll post after class. The other thing I want to say here is if we look at what T3 and T4 do, they act on cells of the liver, cells of the kidneys, our muscle cells, all of the target tissues that will have the functions that we just described, right? This calorogenic types of function. Those will be the target cells that thyroid hormone will act on. Now, when we distinguish between T3 and T4, T3 is usually more actively involved in the target cell response. So usually when T3 and T4 are secreted, T3 will be the active form, the more involved, it's going to be the more abundant secretion as well, and it will go to these cells and begin to have those calorogenic effects that we talked about. Now, T4 can be converted to T3 in the peripheral tissues. So let's say we need more T3. Let's say for some reason you're exercising or you're undergoing a period of fasting, and so you need to tap into more energy stores. You can convert some of that T4 to T3 peripherally, and that can have much more of that active involvement in generating energy. However, T4 is also more involved in the feedback loops. So for this same exact reason, if, for example, we have too much T4 building up, that will go back and signal to either pituitary or hypothalamus to decrease TRH or TSH secretion. And so T4 is going to be more involved in the negative feedback loops. All right. So it's a perfect recipe if you look at it, right? If we have too much T4, that can shut off the axis. And if we have too much T3, or if we have too little T3, we can convert T4 to T3. Okay. Any questions on this bit? Any questions on this? Again, I'm going to update this drawing, correcting this error, and I'll share it in the recordings today. Okay. All right, let's look at the parathyroid hormone. So the parathyroid glands are 4 additional glands that we described. We said that they are embedded in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland itself. So you'd really have to look from a posterior view to be able to see these 4 glands in the back of the thyroid gland. The function of parathyroid hormone is going to be secretion or regulation rather, of calcium levels. So we spoke about the parafollicular cells, right, that secrete calcitonin, and calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels. Alternatively, parathyroid hormone will increase our blood calcium levels. Okay, so definitely don't confuse the parafollicular cells. So the parafollicular cells are part of the thyroid gland itself. They are just in between the follicles. I'm going to jump back here just to show where those cells are. So here's the thyroid gland. Here is the follicle. So these are follicular cells. These guys are responsible for making thyroid hormone. But in between the follicles are what we call parafollicular cells. And these parafollicular cells secrete calcitonin, which decreases blood calcium levels. Whereas the parathyroid gland, which is a separate gland in and of itself, will release parathyroid hormone, and that will have the antagonistic effect of calcitonin that will actually increase blood calcium levels. Okay, so 3 different types of cells here: follicular cells of the thyroid gland secreting thyroid hormone, parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland secreting calcitonin, and then the parathyroid cells of the parathyroid gland, which will secrete parathyroid hormone. All right, let's move on to lecture objective 5. This is to describe the effects of glucocorticoids on the whole body metabolism, and then compare the physiological effects of glucocorticoids to their pharmacological effects. All right, how we can sort of, again, manipulate their mechanism by synthesizing other types of drugs. So if we think about the adrenal gland, we talked about the adrenal before. We talked about it having 2 different parts: the central medulla. So here's the central part of the gland, and this is where we had chromaffin cells, versus the outer part of the gland, which has the cortex. So the cortex is what we're going to focus on as far as the endocrine system and the cortisol secretion. So there are 3 zones, so to speak, of the adrenal cortex that will secrete 3 separate hormones, and they will have different functions. So mineralocorticoids, such as aldosterone, are going to help to regulate sodium and potassium levels. They're going to be secreted by the outermost part of the cortex. Glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, the function of glucocorticoids are to regulate the body's response to stress. And when we say stress here, we mean physiologic stress, physical stress, emotional stress. Any type of discomfort will result in cortisol release to help the body regulate that stress. And that's also going to play into regulating our metabolism as well. And then the third layer down is going to secrete sex hormones such as androgens, and they're going to be responsible for regulating our reproductive function, all right, in both males and in females as well, but more so males as androgens, right, but both sexes. Okay, let's look at the medulla. So the medulla is going to have chromaffin cells, which will secrete mostly epinephrine, but also some level of norepinephrine and a very small amount of dopamine as well. This we have talked about before. We have also talked about the neural control. Remember, the chromaffin cells that are in the adrenal medulla are going to receive innervation from our preganglionic cells. Remember, our preganglionic sympathetic neurons that are leaving the thoracolumbar segment of the spinal cord and then synapsing onto either the sympathetic chain or collateral ganglia or the cells that are located in the adrenal medulla. So we really want to connect the medulla and the chromaffin cells to their role in the autonomic nervous system and to their neural control that is signaled by those preganglion neurons. Okay? And you can even go so far as to recall that the chromaffin cells here behave just like postganglionic neurons in that they will release their secretions in response to that stimulation. Okay, let's look again at the cortex. So going back to the cortex and thinking about those three layers and the different hormones that are released. So glucocorticoids, the main example here is cortisol, but there are other types that are released in the body. This is going to be regulated through the CRH, ACTH axis. So CRH is cortisol releasing hormone. ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And so that's going to be the axis that results in cortisol release from the adrenal cortex. And I also want to include here, although it's not listed, the feedback loop. So the feedback loops will also apply to this axis and all the other axes as well. So the examples of the feedback loops here would be that ACTH from the anterior pituitary can have an effect to decrease the CRH release from hypothalamus, and then cortisol from the adrenal cortex can also have a long loop feedback that will decrease CRH from the hypothalamus as well. So just thinking about those negative feedback loops and how they would apply to this specific axis is important too. Now, cortisol release is going to increase our energy stores, so mobilizing energy stores, that is mobilizing glucose so that we can use it for energy, triglycerides so they can be broken down for energy, and then in rare instances, proteins as well so that they can be liberating energy. Another function of glucocorticoids is that they can suppress the immune response. This is why it's so common that when someone has surgery or someone is undergoing an autoimmune condition, right? If you have an autoimmune condition where your immune response is extremely exaggerated and inappropriate in that it begins to attack itself, right? There are a lot of conditions where the body can have an exaggerated and inappropriate immune response that attacks its own tissues and cells. In those instances, we give these patients steroids. We give these patients glucocorticoids because this is going to help to suppress or dampen that immune response, and this will give these patients some relief from these symptoms. Okay, let's think about the role of cortisol in stress and the stress response. And again, I want to emphasize that when we say stress here, we mean any sort of discomfort, whether that be physiological, right? If you had a surgery or if you had a rupture, injury, or tear of some sort. But it can also be physical stress, as well as emotional stress, right? So if we think about those types of stress, the way that the body responds is the general adaptation syndrome. Okay, it's going to increase cortisol secretion. It's going to increase our sympathetic activity. It's going to increase epinephrine secretion. It's going to increase ADH, so our antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. That is going to be increased as well so that we can hold on to more water as opposed to secreting or releasing more of that. It's going to increase angiotensin II production. And I know we haven't done the kidneys yet, so these two hormones may not make a lot of sense here, but basically it's going to increase our water reabsorption ability and increase our ability to regulate sodium, right? And then lastly, the fight or flight response, which is basically increasing our energy stores, maintaining our blood pressure. Again, that sodium balance is important for blood pressure as well. And so all of these are going to be generated as a part of the stress response, and specifically because cortisol secretion is released, it's going to have these effects globally in the body. Okay, and so if we think about more of the practical consequences of this is that whenever we are stressed, our body automatically goes into fight or flight mode. This is why if you have an exam coming up, right, during the COVID pandemic, where people were not only physically ill, but also, stressed in other ways, financial stress, familial stress, just shifting or disrupting our typical environment. All of those types of stress, the body does not distinguish those from real versus perceived. So this is the mechanism that results in us being in fight or flight. It's hard to create memories. It's hard to learn. It's hard to function. It's hard to reason. It's hard for the rational part of the brain to kick in when we have this type of exaggerated stress response. So I always use this as an opportunity to encourage you guys, when you're studying, when you're stressed with school, definitely think about ways that you can counter that by taking walks, taking deep breaths, because your body is perceiving this emotional stress or mental stress just the way that it would perceive surgery or any type of real physiologic or physical stress. Okay, so definitely counter that, use that understanding to be more mindful about slowing down your heart rate, and doing that type of those types of responses. Right. I'm going to pause here. It's important to focus on the hormone axes. So there was a drawing that I sent out before with last week's recordings. Focus on that axis. Focus on knowing what hypothalamus hormone is secreted, what endocrine gland it's going to act on, what pituitary hormone is then secreted, and then what what tertiary response is going to be the result of that axis. So know that in detail. Also think about the general circulation, so the portal circulation of how hormones leave the hypothalamus, go to the anterior pituitary by way of that portal blood supply. And then also think about the neurons that project from the hypothalamus down to the posterior pituitary and the hormones that are secreted there. So you basically need to know what is secreted whether it's the anterior pituitary involved, posterior pituitary involved, and then also know in detail the different axes, and again, what is secreted from each of those. Okay, as far as this last objective here, you're going to want to focus on, we're going to look at the absorptive state, which I like to refer as the fed state, and the post-absorptive state, which is the fasted state. And again, think about the general principles that apply to both of those states, what hormones are released in those individual states, what types of processes are stimulated in those states, what's a practical example of when the body would be in the absorptive state versus the post-absorptive, and so on. All right, so think about those general principles, or distinguishing between those different axes and those states for the upcoming exam. Okay, so let's continue on here and let's talk about the energy metabolism. So we're going to somewhat shift gears and talk about. I apologize, I somehow lost connection again. And I was rambling on to myself for a good 30 seconds, so there's that. Let's see, I want to make sure everyone is back on. All right, so what we're going to shift gears to look at here is the energy metabolism, the two general states in the body, and how that governs what energy metabolism looks like. So there are two states. One is the absorptive state. Again, I refer to this as the fed state. This is when energy is being stored in the form of macromolecules, which are going to be fats, proteins, and then glucose. And then the post-absorptive state, which is the fasting or fasted state. And this is where energy stores are going to be mobilized. This is where we're going to tap into those stores that were made during the fed state, and we're going to use them to sustain the body during this period until we can get to the next meal. So these are the two general states that we'll talk about. And I want you to connect not only to what's happening biochemically, but also thinking about what's happening practically, right? When would the body be in this state? Why would the body be undergoing one metabolism process versus the other? So that's going to be important. So in the absorptive state, energy input is going to exceed energy output, and this is where nutrients are being absorbed. So again, from a more practical standpoint, think about you having breakfast this morning. So you woke up, you had your breakfast, whatever that was, pancakes, eggs, and then immediately after that meal, your body is in a state where it's absorbing those nutrients, right? Glucose is going to be the primary source of our energy for cells, so your body's going to utilize what it needs immediately. Okay, let's say you are going to go for a walk or a jog, or you exercise this morning. Your muscles are going to need to take some of that immediately for its energy. And then any excess will be stored in the form of our macromolecules. So we're going to store glycogen, away in the liver and in our muscles. We're going to store fats away in our adipose tissue. And so we're going to have those storage forms for when the body needs that during the post-absorptive state later on. Okay, so here is a schematic of what that looks like. What exactly is happening immediately after that meal, and where are we storing any excess energy? So here's the nutrients that we're storing up. We've got glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. This is coming from the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that we have ingested in that meal. Now, immediately, the body is going to metabolize via cellular respiration what it needs for its immediate energy use, right? So that is going to be stored up right away, or not stored up, that's going to be utilized and metabolized right away. The rest of that is going to be stored up in several different forms. So in the liver and muscle cells, we're going to store up some of that glucose as glycogen. And we can also store up some of that glucose as fats in the liver and adipose tissue as well. But then we can store up fatty acids directly metabolized from that meal in our triglycerides as well. So triglycerides can be the storage form of glycerol, which is excess glucose, but then also fatty acids, which are coming from fats that we've ingested, and those can all be stored up as triglycerides. As far as proteins that we've ingested, those are broken down to amino acids, and those can be stored in our muscle as, protein building up muscle, but also those can be converted in the liver into fatty acids, which can be stored up as triglycerides, and then they can be stored in our adipose tissue. So basically, we can store up energy in our liver cells, our muscle cells, and then we can have storage in our fat or adipose tissue as well. So we can begin to see here that the body is very smart. It's very efficient. As much food as you will take in, as much nutrients as you will take in, the body will use what it needs and store the rest, right? That's a general principle that really only applies to the gastrointestinal system. If we think about homeostasis in any other part of the body will generally take what it needs and discard the rest. It will try to get to a set point. But a very unique case or unique scenario happens with the gastrointestinal system, where the body has no choice but to store any excess nutrients that is taken in. And so this is where we can begin to get into imbalances with our energy if we are exceeding energy input and that is not being utilized in the post-absorptive state. All right, let's shift gears to look at the post-absorptive state. Again, I'm going to refer to this as the fasted state, right? If you've gone for a long period without energy, any food or energy, let's say you were asleep and you woke up. Typically when you wake up from a nap or when you wake up in the morning, your body is in this state because it has gone for at least 12 hours without food. And so energy output in this scenario is going to outweigh energy input. Here, glucose is going to be sort of spared for the nervous system. We have talked about this before, the fact that the nervous system really prefers glucose as its main source of energy. Other tissues in the body can utilize fatty acids, which are fats, or even ketones in some instances. Those can be utilized for energy in other areas of the body. But the brain is going to be very spoiled, very particular in its preference for glucose. And so most of that is going to be spared for the nervous system. We're also going to use stored nutrients. So stored nutrients that have been uptaken in our adipose tissue, in our liver, in our muscles, those can begin to be metabolized and mobilized, and they can be used to sustain the body during this post-absorptive state until we can get to the next meal. So once again, we can already begin to see that if your energy output is outweighing your energy input, that can also lead to other types of imbalances, right? You can think about being malnourished or undernourished for your body weight and height. So this is where we want to think about that fine, delicate balance where our energy input is equally balanced to our energy output in the long term in order to avoid some of these imbalances and to keep our body in homeostasis. All right, let's look at the flow chart or the logistics of how we tap into these storage forms of energy in the post-absorptive state. So we've got lots of stored molecules. And again, you've gone a long period without any food. So your body's going to start to be looking for anywhere that there are storage forms of energy so that we can tap into those for energy. So muscle will be a last resort. I like to really preface this. The body does not like to break down muscle for energy. This is really a last resort option. Typically, it will start with glycogen first and then move over to adipose. So while breaking down muscle is an option, I want to kind of put the exception here. This is typically a last resort. So proteins can be broken down to amino acids. Amino acids can then be metabolized to generate energy. Triglycerides from our adipose tissue can also be broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. The fatty acid components can be metabolized, again, to generate energy. And this is typically for our non-nervous tissue. Remember, the nervous tissue really prefers glycogen and glucose. So these are some options that are going to be feasible for more of our other body tissues. Glycerol can be converted into ketones in the liver, and our ketones can be used in both our nervous tissue and non-nervous tissue as an alternate source of energy. And then if we think about it, our liver and muscle can both store up glycogen, and that glycogen can be broken down into glucose, and that glucose can be utilized preferably in the brain and the nervous tissue, but it can also be utilized in other areas generally as well.